Chapters 13, 14, and 15 today. When we left Edward, he had just been rescued by Bull and Lucy. Here's a picture of Bull from the dump where he ended up because of Lolly. They traveled on foot. They traveled in empty rail cars. They were always on the move. Now they is being Bull, Lucy, and Edward, of course. But in truth, said Bull, we are going nowhere. That, my friend, is the irony of our constant movement. Edward rode in Bull's bedroll, slung over Bull's shoulder, with only his head and ears sticking out. Bull was always careful to position the rabbit so that he was not looking up or down, but was instead forever looking behind him at the road they had just traveled. At night they slept on the ground under the stars. There are the stars again. After her initial disappointment about Edward being unfit for consumption, took a liking to him and slept curled up beside him. Sometimes she even rested her muzzle on his china stomach, and then the noises she made in her sleep, whimpering and growling and chuffing, resonated inside Edward's body. To his surprise, he began to feel a deep tenderness for the dog. During the night, while Bull and Lucy slept, Edward, with his ever-open eyes, stared up at the constellations. Now remember, those are the pictures made from stars. He said their names, and then he said the names of the people who loved him. He started with Abilene, and then went to Nellie and Lawrence, and from there to Bull and Lucy, and he ended again with Abilene. Abilene, Nellie, Lawrence, Bull, Lucy, Abilene. See, Edward told Pellegrina, I am not like the princess. I know about love. Here's a picture. Here's Bull and Lucy there in the bottom, and Edward sitting on Bull's lap. So you can see, it says Edward loved it when Bull sang. There were times, too, when Bull and Lucy gathered round a campfire with other tramps, or other hobos. Bull was a good storyteller and an even better singer. Sing for us, Bull! The men shouted. Bull sat with Lucy leaning against his leg, and Edward balanced on his right knee, and he sang from somewhere deep inside himself. Just as Edward could feel Lucy's whimpers and growls resonate through his body at night, he could also feel the deep, sad sound of Bull's songs move through him. Edward loved it when Bull sang. And he was grateful to Bull, too, for sensing that a dress was not the right kind of clothing for Edward. Malone, said Bull one night, it's not my desire to offend you or to comment negatively on your choice of garb, but I'm forced to tell you that you stick out like a sore thumb in that princess dress. And also, again, with no wish to offend you, that dress has seen better days. Nellie's beautiful dress had not fared well at the dump, or its subsequent ramblings with Bull and Lucy. It was so torn and dirty and full of holes that it barely resembled a dress anymore. I have a solution, said Bull, and I hope that it meets with your approval. He took his own knit stocking cap and cut a big hole in the top of it and 2 small holes on the side of it, and then he took off Edward's dress. Now, if you remember, back when Edward was on the ship and the 2 boys were teasing Abilene about his clothes and, oh, his clothes come off and, oh, he's naked. So now Edward's got his clothes off again. Look away, Lucy, he said to the dog. Let's not embarrass Malone by staring at his nakedness, which is very different than the boys on the ship. Bull slid the hat over Edward's head and pulled it down and poked his arms through the smaller holes. There you go, he told Edward. Now you just need some pants. The pants Bull made himself, cutting up several red handkerchiefs and sewing them together so they formed a makeshift covering for Edward's long legs. Now you have the proper outlaw look, said Bull, standing back to admire his work. Now you look like a rabbit on the run. Chapter 14. So now you can see Edward's new outfit. There's his bandana pants. And his beanie made kind of looks like a sweater that Bull made him to wear. At first, the others thought that Edward was a great good joke. "A rabbit!" the hobo said, laughing. "Let's chop him up and let's put him in the stew pot." Or when Bull sat with Edward carefully balanced on his knees, one of them would call out, "Got yourself a little dolly, huh, Bull?" Edward, of course, felt a surge of anger at being referred to as a dolly, but Bull never got angry. He simply sat with Edward on his knee and said nothing. Soon, the men became accustomed to Edward, and the word of his existence spread. So it was that when Bull and Lucy stepped up to a campfire in another town, another state, another place entirely, the men knew Edward and were glad to see him. "Malone!" they shouted in unison. And Edward felt a warm rush of pleasure at being recognized, at being known. Whatever it was that had begun in Nellie's kitchen, Edward's new and strange ability to sit very still and concentrate the whole of his being on the stories of another became invaluable around the hobo campfire. "Look at Malone," said a man named Jack one evening. "He's listening to every dang word." "Certainly," said Bull. "Of course he is." Later that night, Jack came, sat next to Bull, and asked if he could borrow the rabbit. Bull handed Edward over, and Jack sat with Edward upon his knee. He whispered into Edward's ear. "Helen," Jack said, "and Jack Jr. and Taffy, she's the baby. Those are my kids' names. They're all in North Carolina. You ever been to North Carolina? It's a pretty state. That's where they are. Helen, Jack Jr., Taffy. You remember their names, okay, Malone?" After this, wherever Bull and Lucy and Edward went, some tramp would take Edward aside and whisper the names of his children in Edward's ear. Betty, Ted, Nancy, William, Jimmy, Eileen, Skipper, Faith. Edward knew what it was like to say over and over again the names of those you had left behind. He knew what it was like to miss someone, and so he listened. And in his listening, his heart opened wide and even wider still. The rabbit stayed lost with Lucy and Bill for a long time. Almost 7 years passed, and in that time, Edward became an excellent tramp. Happy to be on the road, restless when he was still. The sound of the wheels on the train tracks became a music that soothed him. He could have ridden the rails forever. But one night, in a railroad yard in Memphis, Tennessee, as Bull and Lucy slept in an empty freight car and Edward kept watch, trouble arrived. A man entered the freight car and shone a flashlight in Bull's face and kicked him awake. "You bum," he said. "You dirty bum. I'm sick of you guys sleeping everywhere. This ain't no motel." Bull sat up slowly. Lucy started to bark. "Shut up," said the man. He delivered a swift kick to Lucy's side that made her yelp in surprise. All his life, Edward had known what he was, a rabbit made of china. A rabbit with bendable arms and legs and ears. He was bendable, though, only if he was in the hands of another. He could not move himself, and he had not ever regretted this more deeply than he did that night when he was with Bull and Lucy, when they were discovered in the empty rail car. Edward wanted to be able to defend Lucy, but he could do nothing. He could only lie there and wait. "Say something," said the man to Bull. Bull put his hands up in the air. He said, "We are lost." "Lost? Ha! You bet you're lost." And then the man said, "What's this?" And he shone his light on Edward. "That's Malone," said Bull. "What the heck?" said the man. He poked at Edward with the toe of his boot. "Things are out of control. Things are out of hand. Not on my watch. No, sir. Not when I'm in charge." The train suddenly lurched into motion. "No, sir," said the man again. He looked down at Edward. "No free rides for rabbits." He turned and flung open the door of the rail car, and he turned back with one swift kick. He sent Edward sailing out into the darkness. The rabbit flew through the late spring air. Far from behind him, he heard Lucy's anguished howl. "Ow! Ow! Ow!" she cried. Edward landed with a most alarming thump, and then he tumbled and tumbled and tumbled down a long, dirty hill. When he finally stopped moving, he was on his back, staring up at the night sky. The world was silent. He could not hear Lucy. He could not hear the train. Edward looked up at the stars. He looked to say the names of the constellations, but then he stopped. Bull, his heart said. Lucy. How many times, Edward wondered, would he have to leave without getting the chance to say goodbye? A lone cricket started up a song. Edward listened. Something deep inside him ached. He wished that he could cry. Last chapter for today. Whoops! Ah! Chapter 15. So if you don't know what that is, that looks like a crow sitting on a fence post. Take a second, pause the video. Tell Mom and Dad what you think might happen. In the morning, the sun rose and the cricket song gave way to bird song. An old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. Humph, she said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. Looks like a rabbit, she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. Only, he ain't real. She stood back up. Humph, she said again. She rubbed her back. What I say is there's a use for everything and everything has a use. That's what I say. What do you think's going to happen to Edward now? I'm always a little scared for him. Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache that he felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling. One of hollowness and despair. There's that word again, despair. Pick me up or don't pick me up, the Edward thought. It makes no difference to me. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and then she kept walking, swinging her basket and singing, Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Edward, in spite of himself, listened. I've seen troubles too, he thought. You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet. Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his velvet ears to the wooden pole and spread his arms out as if he were flying and attached his paws to the pole by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from the pole, so pie pans. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare them off, said the old lady. Scare who off, thought Edward. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. Go on, Clyde, said the woman. She clapped her hands. You got to act ferocious. Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh aloud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? Susanna, Malone, and now Clyde? The old woman clapped her hands again. Get to work, Clyde, she said. Scare them birds off. And then she walked away from him out of the garden and toward her small house. There he is, strung up to be a scarecrow. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads in his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on a pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. Caw, 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 without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I am done with caring. Caw, caw, said the Pellegrina crow. Finally the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his velvet ears and stared up at the night sky. He saw the stars. But for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. He felt made fun of. "You're down there alone," the stars seemed to say to him, "and we're up here in our constellations together." "I have been loved," Edward told the stars. "So," said the stars, "what difference does that make when you're all alone now?" Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned, and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought with her a boy. Here's your preview for chapter 16. I hope that you guys are enjoying getting to know Edward and his adventure. His journey it just keeps twisting and turning around, and he keeps changing a little bit. His character evolves a lot throughout this book. So think about how Edward has changed from the beginning of the story when he was with Abilene and to now, how he's changed. Think about all the ways the stars have been talked about. And also, again, if the sky is clear, go see if you can find some constellations outside. I hope you're enjoying Edward. I'll see you next time.